Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. What we try to do in this weekly review is to cover international happenings all over the continents, different continents, and particularly focusing on those incidents, those individuals, those issues that impinge on India's foreign policy and our national interest. And what we have for you this time is a very 360-degree kind of coverage. We start from Indo-Pacific region. We start with Shangri-La Dialogues early in the month of June. Then we move over to the BRICS meeting in China, and which is followed with the G7 meeting in Europe. So we cover from Indo-Pacific region to Europe. And then, of course, we take into account when we go to G7, obviously the impact of the Ukraine war, what is happening in the rest of the world, how it impinges on food security, energy security. The war is well into its fourth month now, and there seems to be no sign of the war ending in a hurry. There have been developments elsewhere. There have been interesting, dramatic developments in domestic politics in the United States, where Roe and Wade has been set aside by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has also given a decision in favor of the arms as a birthright for fundamental right lobby. This seems to be that America, which lectures the rest of the world about democratic values, humanitarian values, secular values, seems to be slipping back along the lines of religious fundamentalism, white supremacy, and a country divided sharply down the middle. Now, what America does in domestic politics is Americans' business, but how it impinges on the rest of the world, how much time Biden would have to focus on international events elsewhere would be interesting to watch. We also have a quick look at Africa, which we have not visited in recent past, where there has been trouble brewing in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Rwanda, in Uganda, also in South Africa, the charges of gigantic corruption, and also the increasing footprint of the Islamic terrorists in Mali and also in Nigeria. We'll have a look at all this and more, and we'll, of course, discuss India's neighborhood whenever we get a little time, about Afghanistan, about Sri Lanka, and I think you will have a very interesting session gaining insights into international events, which will help you prepare much better for your civil service examinations. Let us begin with the Shangri-La Dialogue. It is almost 2 decades back that the think tank, the famous think tank in United Kingdom, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, International Institute, IAS, launched this informal, non-governmental summit in Singapore. And the name comes from the hotel where the first meeting was held, the Shangri-La Hotel. And the idea was to get together in one place, top government leaders, intellectuals, people representing NGOs, media, to have a broad picture, broad strategic perspective on the Indo-Pacific region, what was happening. Now, these summits were very popular. You could compare them something like to the Raisina summits or the Nimrana dialogues, where a broad range of ideas were mooted and discussed openly without any commitment or binding. For the past 2 years, there was a hiatus. Ever since coronavirus struck the world, the summits could not be held. And let's remember that in 2018, the Shangri-La Summit, the keynote speaker was the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who had articulated very forcefully what India's perspective on this region was. But let us not forget that in the past 2 years, much has changed in the Indo-Pacific region, much has changed in the international global strategic scenario, and Shangri-La Dialogue has been devalued a bit. Now, there are some people, India did not participate in the Shangri-La Dialogue this year for a variety of reasons that India had to walk a very tightrope, diplomatic tightrope. It did not want to confront China there because with China it has had a strained relationship ever since Galwan, although some tensions have been reduced by now. It also did not want to take a position with America and the Japan and Australians and the others present criticizing Russia, a very time-tested friend for India. And India has done its best to not overtly criticize or condemn Russian military intervention in Ukraine, but talked in terms of the war must end, violence is not a solution to any problem, human rights should be respected, etc., etc. But it thought it wise that some critics of Mr. Modi thought that India was missing an opportunity. But we don't think so, because the Shangri-La Dialogue seems to have lost its raison d'etre. It is no longer as important to have these informal meetings every year and have a broad picture. It is not only the war in Ukraine which has devalued the Shangri-La dialogues. I think what has happened in the region itself makes a very great difference. First, the Americans tried to have the Quads there, and then the Quads assigned a very important role to India. But then when AUKUS came up, Quads was marginalized. And India's strategic significance as a countervailing factor to China was underplayed. India was compensated with high-sounding agenda and mandate that you do work about vaccine diplomacy, about technology transfers, about climate change, about cultural exchanges, etc., etc. But strategy was not there. And at the same time, when AUKUS came there, AUKUS brought to surface the divide between the allies itself, between the French and the Americans, the French and the Australians about the submarine deal. We have covered that in past with you. And also this Shangri-La group has become so broad-based that you have the ASEAN countries, you have China, you have Japan, you also have countries like Fiji, you have countries like United States. So it is countries which are very disparate in their power potential, and their perspective on their strategic interests in this region varies very greatly. The Chinese have been very active in the past 2 years, trying to spread their footprint in the small Micronesian states in the Pacific, Southwest Pacific. They have met with some rebuffs in Fiji and all, but they have not given up. The ASEAN countries are again in a position, which is a difficult position, where ASEAN countries includes countries like Myanmar and Cambodia, which are very much under Chinese influence. There are countries like Thailand, which have to please all parties all the time. But countries like Indonesia have tread with caution, and they have an interest in the Southwest Pacific region due to their Irian Barat positions. Papua New Guinea touches on this territory. So Australia and Indonesia also have to worry about their trade relationship with China. All the ASEAN countries have close trade relationship with China. So whatever potential 2 decades back the Shangri-La dialogues had, to our mind, is no longer there, no longer substantial. But then one might ask, then why are we discussing this at all? We are discussing this for a very good reason, that multilateral diplomacy seems to be the focus of all actors, majors, big powers, the erstwhile superpowers, and try to, after the Ukraine war, the world seems to be divided again into not 2 blocks, 2 camps. The camps which have Russia, China on one side, and America, its European Union allies on the other side. But then this still leaves a lot of the world outside. So the general ideas, lines are very fluid. So whatever was the hope from Shangri-La dialogue, probably can it be transferred if China is trying to do it in its favor in the BRICS? So the BRICS Summit, which took place in China hosting it, it seemed was a response to whatever the Western countries were trying to do in the Shangri-La dialogue. Again, since the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has had various antics, the potential of Britain playing a role post-Brexit has considerably weakened its impact on international affairs. The posturing continues. So even the IAS, the think tank in Britain, cannot be expected to play the same significant path-breaking, pioneering, maintaining role, which was 2 decades back. Much has changed in the 2 decades. Putin has emerged much more powerful in Russia, unchallenged. Xi Jinping is in a position where he's going to be in the Hall of Fames and the all-time greats in China. So both in Russia and China, the leadership, the international politics, their alignments, coincidence, and overlaps of interest have rendered Shangri-La dialogues, to our mind, redundant. But we begin with Shangri-La dialogues because this was the beginning in the June, which paved the way, so to speak, of how the other countries will calibrate their diplomacies in BRICS and elsewhere. The second important multilateral gathering in the month of June was the BRICS Summit in China. China is the host this year. China is chairing the BRICS thing, and this is a rotating chair, and India participated in enthusiastically, and even if virtually, it was an important diplomatic interaction. Now, BRICS, again, when it was initiated, it grew out of something called IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. It was meant to be a tri-continental partnership which represented a large segment of the world's population, a large potential of natural resources, and their combined economies were not insignificant at all in international relations. But when, with passage of time, Russia and China joined it, the whole nature of the gathering changed, because Russia and China both belong to the permanent veto-wielding members community of the United Nations Security Council, and they render the other members, if we may say so, a little less important. And of course, this is interesting because India has had a fraught relationship with China after an initial period of bonhomie and goodwill in Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. Ever since the mid-50s, particularly after the 1962 military conflict, there has been tension brewing between India and China, and it has been an adversarial relationship, a competitive relationship, whether it is a model of development, whether it is a mode of governance, and whether it is a clash of direct interest in the Himalayan borderland, disputed borderland, or in South China Sea, or in the Indian Ocean region. China has always had this mindset that it is inherited to a historical legacy going back thousands of years, and it is far more important than India in Asia and in the world. So even if a role for India is to be talked about, it has to be a role, if not subordinate, then at least secondary or supplementary to what China's role is. Indians have a different view on this. Indians feel that they are also inheritors of thousands of year-old civilization. Their model of governance, a pluralistic, democratic, representative model, is far superior, and it can be more attractive to the rest of the world. So the question is not today Mao versus Gandhi, or it is Xi versus Modi, but the point is that there is an issue of a democracy and an authoritarian, autocratic regime. So there's one part of the issue. But then Russia again is an authoritarian regime, is not exactly a democracy, and both Russia and China at one time were inspired by the Marxist-Leninist ideology. Much has changed in Russia and much has changed in China. But at the core, there is some commitment to socialism, there is some commitment to state control of economic development, and also a different interpretation of international relations, international law, and human rights as they exist. So if we talk of BRICS today, it is not the BRICS which was originally conceived. And not only that, I think let's not only concentrate on what has changed in Russia and China and how it impacts on India. Let's see how things have changed in Brazil and South Africa also. For past 10 years or more, Brazil has been in a state of political flux. Even when President Lula was there, he was targeted by the Americans as a leftist threat to the whole of the Latin American continent. When he was ousted and taken over, the power was taken over by Bolsonaro, there has been a very disturbing trend when Bolsonaro has been as authoritarian as any other military dictator, conservative, rightist, with fascist inclinations, past or present. He has behaved erratically. He has cocked a snook at America. He has not been curbed and controlled. He has led to large-scale dislocation, devastation of the Amazon rainforest. The rights of indigenous people have been threatened. He proved himself to be totally incompetent to deal with the COVID pandemic. But the problem is that Brazil is probably the country in the Latin American continent which has the potential to be the country of primacy, the predominant country in the subcontinent. It is technologically sophisticated, whether it is rocketry, whether it is nuclear research, whether it is biotechnology, and also because it controls the Amazon rainforest, what policies are sensibly or madly followed in Brazil is going to have an impact on the global climate change politics. So, and Bolsonaro has made no bones about his supporting the Russians under Putin in Ukraine. So there is this situation, and then we come to South Africa. In South Africa, which we shall discuss in slightly greater detail a little later in the same program, there has been turmoil, and the hopes have been belied of reconciliation. And ever since apartheid, the rule of apartheid ended, the white capitalistic monopoly has not been dislodged. There has been gigantic, titanic corruption. First it was President Zuma, now it is President Cyril Ramaphosa. The country has failed to cope with COVID. The country has failed to provide social justice or the rule of law most of the time, and the lawlessness prevails in this country. Now, that again is not any other country's business, but what it makes a difference is that if in BRICS, Brazil and South Africa are racked by problems of their own internal domestic politics, and Russia and China have different worldviews and perspective, where does that leave India? India has only a limited role to play in BRICS when there are two countries larger than this in geographical mass and in population, both of them veto-holding members of Security Council and having their own agendas in international politics. With one, India has an adversarial relationship, and not only in South China Sea, but also in the Himalayan borderland. Now, again, when we come to this time's BRICS was important because China was mooting a very interesting idea. China was inviting 13 other countries to join it. So what was happening is that we just noticed that how from 3 countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, when 2 more were added, the whole complexion of the organization was changed. When we say 13 more are going to change, which 13 are going to change? All the ASEAN countries, some of the ASEAN countries. Will these be the countries favorable to China? Will these be the countries naturally inclined towards Soviet Union or having a relationship with Soviet Union? And where would that be India? Would India in that case be in Brazil, more or less torn between divided loyalties to 2 blocks? Does it stay with the Western democracies or does it go on the sides of more or less authoritarian regimes, but within its own region? And of course, India has never criticized the rule of law, international regimes about human rights, etc., like China has done, like Russia has done. China has blatantly said that it has had nothing to do with the evolution of international law or with the human rights concept or the doctrine, so they are not necessarily bound by it. India has never said so. India has always been on the side of the rule of law, international regimes about human rights, and so on. But at the same time, India has been put in the dock many a time by the Western countries for violation of imagined or real violations of human rights in India, and India has had to explain it. Now, this is interesting because there is always double standards applied in these cases. When it comes to the Americans, it comes to Canadians, it comes to Australians, New Zealand, they always have double standards. How they have treated during their colonial regime the indigenous people is blatantly violative of human rights. How human rights continue to be violated even today in terms of reproductive rights of people, especially as they affect the non-whites, how the white supremacists, the gun right holders, etc., are being supported by judiciary, is making a mockery of what you call a democratic polity. So if there are strong authoritarian trends which were reflected when President Trump was the President of the United States, can there be a difference between a democracy defined in West or the kind of mockery which of parliamentary government which Boris Johnson made is something which we have to keep in mind. This brings us to the G7 meeting in the last week of June. The whole month of June, as we notice, has been full of these multilateral diplomatic interactions, first in Shangri-La Dialogue, then in BRICS Summit, and then now in the G7. Now, the G7, again, is a very interesting, informal, non-treaty-based get-together organization. It is a club, shall we say, of the 7 richest countries in the world. It includes America, Canada, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japan is the only non-European, non-white nation originally included in this gathering. There was a time when Russia was also a member of the G7. So it was G8 then. And Russia was excluded, banished after it claimed Crimea, and this was supposed to be a punishment. They have been ousted. The erstwhile president of the United States, Trump, kept arguing that Russia should be brought back into G7, but this has not happened. Now, a close look at this organizational structure makes it very clear that it is a get-together of the whites, those who belong to the Western alliance system, to impose their will and their worldview on the rest of the world. Of course, it is claimed that they control 46-47% of the gross income of the whole world. It is also argued with very good reason. They account for almost 50% of the gross domestic produce of the whole world. But the interesting part is that it includes only 10% of the world's population. And if you exclude the only Asian member out of this, the representation of the population would be reduced, and also the disproportionate influence which these richer countries play, it would also be exposed. There also is a tradition of an unenumerated member. The G7 does not mention European Union, which is a presence lurking, looming behind, and which has combined GDP, combined income, combined power potential, much more than anybody else. Within the G7 membership, there are imbalances. The American economy is the number one economy, many trillion-dollar economy in the world. The other countries register a fall suddenly. The Japanese are the next, but if you take the Europeans, the Germans, the French, the British, the Italians, the Canadians, have very small economies. I mean, they are comparable more to India's economy. I mean, close to $4 to $5 trillion. Now, the point is that India has been jostling for the position and pushing away United Kingdom or is yielding place to it. Why we are mentioning this thing is that if Japan can be a permanent member of the G7, why can't India be there? Why can't India be there where it is a larger economy, larger potential than many of the European nations? It also disregards or overlooks that within the European Union has a very large chunk of the GDP and the income and the technological potential, but all countries are not equal. There is a great divisions, and the decision-making process of the European Union is such that it emphasizes consensus. So it cannot always prescribe things to the rest of the people and then follow it up within their own union. This has been brought out after Brexit. It's been brought out after the economic sanctions imposed on Russia, about the trade war, which at one stage Trump declared on China. But the dependency of the European Unions, including the major actors like France and Germany, Germany especially, its dependence for energy security on the Russian gas resources, or France and UK included on the intermediaries on technology, telecom, etc., or vaccine intermediaries on China. The supply chain interruptions during COVID exposed the dependency of the world on the rest of the world on China. So G7 doesn't make sense because the number 2 economy in the world is China after United States of America. So if we want to treat G7 seriously, we must examine the contradictions within the G7. Why should it not include China? And why should it, this year, India has been invited as a special invitee. And the Indian Prime Minister has gone there, but let's not be very happy and pat our backs with just this achievement. What the West is trying is to tempt India, lure India away from its possible alignment, shift or drift towards China and Russia post Russia's intervention in Ukraine, and bring it back on the side of the democracies. When President Biden organized a summit of democracies, it was quite clear that it was a hand-picked loyalists who were being invited for this. The definition of democracy was challenged by nations in Africa and Asia, of course in Russia and China, and of course when you try to say that India is a democracy cast in the Western mold, it should follow blindly whatever the West does. It doesn't make sense in the third decade of the 21st century. So the government of India has always, in the past 7, 8, 9 years, made it very clear that it has a mind of its own, it has national interests of its own, and it is not going to follow blindly dictates of any other country. So Indian Prime Minister being invited to the G7 meeting this year is not an recognition, unalloyed, unquestioned of India's emergence as a major actor in international affairs, but it appears to be a juicy carrot being dangled before India to join this gathering and then distance itself over from the other camp. Of course, whether it is the European Union leaders, whether it's the French president, whether it's the Germans, Scholz, they say we understand India's compulsions. We know that India cannot immediately come out of the Russian, shall we say, sphere of friendly influence. But we expect India to recognize its responsibilities as a democratic nation and take a stand accordingly. So I think G7 again is interestingly nothing formal. It is an imposition by the rich nations in the world, especially the whites in the Western European world and America, to impose their will and their worldview on the rest. I think India has to tread with caution and not fall for easy temptations and salts. The Indian Prime Minister used his trip for the G7 summit very well, as is his wont. He addressed the Indian diaspora in Munich. He displayed how popular he continues to be with the Indians staying abroad. And what he did very farsightedly, on his way back home, he made a stopover to share the bereavement of the Sultan of Abu Dhabi, the Amir of Abu Dhabi, who had passed away. And he would sort of project that he cared for this neighborhood in UAE, in the Gulf countries, so very much. And this is important because in recent past, due to some reckless statement made by irresponsible members of the ruling party about Hazrat Muhammad the Prophet, peace be on him, where this tension had arisen that some Muslim countries had been very apprehensive about whether Indians were being careful enough to protect the interests of minorities, the Muslims. And although some people very categorically said it's a matter of domestic politics of India, and they believe that Indians would be dealing legally with all such miscreants, but still it is worthwhile that you lend a personal touch, you combine a little bit of a bilateral diplomacy with multilateral diplomacy when Indian national interest is to be safeguarded. The misfortune of Africa is that it remains in perpetual turmoil, but then the world has gotten used to this ongoing tumult, ongoing violence, ongoing genocide, ongoing bloodshed, and it has become an endemic. So people shift their attention to crises which are more explosive elsewhere, but this time it is becoming difficult to keep our eyes away from Africa. The most volatile, most explosive situation seems to be brewing in the heart of Africa, in the Central Africa, where Democratic Republic of Congo is there, and there have been incursions in the border between Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, and also the Republic of Congo, and also the violence spilling over to Ugandan border on the other side. Now, what is happening is something which is related to a legacy of colonialism, but it is not only that the Belgians, before they left Congo, left it in a shape that it was partitioned, there was a long-drawn civil war, the country was divided, and has never recovered from that. That is history. That is almost more than half a century past. What is causing the trouble there is that these countries are unfortunately very rich resources of diamonds, rare minerals, gold, traces of oil, etc. So, and if there is no government which can legitimately exercise its sovereign authority and control the predators who are trying to illegally exploit these natural resources, smuggle them out of the country, are creating a major problem of anarchy. The other thing is that the colonial masters may have withdrawn, but the countries have left behind the legacy as blood-sucking leeches, the multinational corporations, who play a very dubious role. They either encourage corruption of the legitimately elected governments, they try to have mercenaries to seek protection for their own activities, they don't care for the natural resources, and this encourages what is called blood diamonds and boy soldiers and things of that kind. These countries have their peripheries, again, date back to the colonial period where the boundaries were divided arbitrarily. After civil war, they were partitioned in a manner where the natural boundaries have been violated, which have separated artificially ethnic communities, agriculturalists, pastoralists, farmers, animal husbandry people. So this Rwanda-Burundi bloodshed genocide was in past purely ethnic, Tutsis and Hutus. Now this has left behind a legacy, a very bitter legacy, and reconciliation has never come. So what we are witnessing in the heart of Africa this time is this thing, spillover of the violence, which has been simmering all the while. Now, Ugandans have been having problems of their own. Ugandans are asking questions whether they are destined to live with dynastic rule from father to son, from army imposed on them. And then Ugandans also say that, look, they are blamed repeatedly because they have to protect their own citizen. They have to securely block their borders, but this cannot be done. So what we are witnessing in Democratic Republic of Congo with Rwanda and Uganda is likely to exacerbate into a major conflict in near future, unless it's controlled right now. But can it be controlled right now? Because what is happening in Africa elsewhere is again distracting us from what is happening here. The thing which has captured the world's imagination is the northwestern tip of the African continent. That is where in Mali, in recent past, there have been repeated attacks by the supposedly insurgents, bandits, but these are euphemisms for the Islamic terrorists, fundamentalists, who have killed 200 people over the past week. A week before that, 100 people were killed, civilians are killed, villages are kidnapped, school kids are kidnapped, ransom is received, sometimes dead bodies are returned, sometimes we don't even know what happened to them. And there is the trade in narcotics, in illegal arms, and this has not been controlled ever since France was asked to withdraw by Mali. They thought that the ex-colonial master was trying to get back through the back door, but the fact remains that the French presence, whether it was the Foreign Legion or the United Nations, was stemming the violence to a large extent. The UN peacekeepers have been also targeted and killed. Human relief workers have been killed. This has happened in Niger. This has happened in Nigeria. This has happened in Mali. Especially in Nigeria, the government seems to have almost abdicated its sovereign powers. Now, in Nigeria is a special case because Nigeria is divided between North and South, between Christians and Muslims, and of course, an assorted tribal ethnic loyalties, which is happening. But Nigeria is an oil exporting country, which is at the moment having some energy security problems. It had a very nice railway network at one stage, which is not very functional. The difference between cities and the countryside is very great. And the area which the government controls is constantly shrinking, never expanding. So whether it is Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, this is the disturbed area, and also the Western Sahara, the Polisario region. Now, this is one part. But then you come to the other tip of Africa and you still have no peace, no sign of peace returning in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. We have repeated incidents of violence, international workers being killed, and is virtually an anarchical situation. Genocide has been accused, human rights violations have been accused. Probably both sides are guilty, but there doesn't seem to be any respite from this. So under these circumstances, to imagine that people would worry about the heart of Africa in Democratic Republic of Congo is difficult to imagine. This is not all. Then we come to the southernmost tip, the South Africa. South Africa at one stage was supposed to be an industrialized country, well on way towards the middle income group country, technologically very sophisticated, endowed with great natural resources. And when the apartheid ended, people thought that there would be reconciliation now, truth and reconciliation. It has not happened at all. Unfortunately, the African National Congress has fallen prey to being the most corrupt organization at all. The predecessor of the present president, Zuma, in league with Indian businessmen, the Gupta family, ruined the economy of the country. There was large-scale corruption, and the Gupta brothers, after the fall of President Zuma, had to escape. But they have been arrested recently in Dubai, and the extradition process is on to bring them back to justice to South Africa. But as if this was not enough, the present President Cyril Ramaphosa has been embroiled in a very grave charge of corruption. The story is very interesting. He had a large animal farm, and he had sold game for millions of dollars US and hidden the money in the furniture in his farm. There was a theft in his farm. He did not report it to the police, but he used the presidential security guards and the intelligence agencies to find out where the money had gone, who had perpetrated this theft. And in nearby Namibia, again through informal, unofficial channels, a thief was nabbed, and this was there. But this immediately raised the question, how was he dealing with a currency which is highly regulated, the US dollars, and millions of dollars, and where they reported, why they were hidden in the furniture, and why a why not a police complaint was filed, and while this was there. So he at the moment appears as tainted as his predecessor. Uh, the interesting thing is that the Secret Service Agency of the government itself is supposed to be very, very corrupt. And it was used to blackmail people who had money, to threaten them, to extort money out of them. So there is this interesting that the law enforcement agencies again are tainted, the president is tainted, the party is tainted, and the common man suffers. And it is said that the white monopoly capital remains very much intact in Africa. The record of Cyril Ramaphosa has not been much better in tackling with the COVID pandemic than any other else. There has been a commission of inquiry under Justice Zondo, but nobody thinks that it is such a complex and a large litany of charges against practically all the top members of Zuma's cabinet, law enforcement agencies, and now President Cyril Ramaphosa, that nobody believes that anybody would be brought to book ultimately. So maybe some scapegoats would be found, but that would not be enough. It would neither change the system nor it would help the Africans to regain what their legitimate claim to resources is and how they live. So this is what the state of Africa is, and I don't think that it is going to change in very near future. What Indians have to worry about is not only the historic ties we have with South Africa. We should worry more about our economic ties in present day with the countries on the east coast of Africa, countries in the northwestern coast of Africa, where oil is produced, where trade has been there traditionally, and where we have an access to the rest of the subcontinent, the rest of the continent. But we do not necessarily have to be embroiled with conflicts, ethnic conflicts especially, whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's Somalia. After we have cast our look far and wide to Europe, to Indo-Pacific region, the time has come to focus on the neighborhood. The neighborhood has been a troubled neighborhood in recent past. Sri Lanka, it doesn't seem, is going to get out of the economic crisis making of the Rajapaksa family in near future at all. The Ranil Wickremesinghe was optimistic. He thought that he could pull the country up from the shoestrings. It has not happened. They are still waiting from one dole to another dole, one relief measure to another relief measure. The IMF relief package hasn't quite been worked through. Petrol is not available for even essential services. Power cuts continue, and the price of fuel has gone up. Appeals are made to people not to use their vehicles, but it cannot happen. The country cannot run its economy unless fuel is not available. And the Sri Lankan Prime Minister has been forced to admit that Indians cannot bail out for all time to come the Sri Lankans. Indians can make credit lines available, but Sri Lankans have fallen so deep down the abyss that they have to pay in cash for emergency fuel supplies also. And without fuel supplies, neither hospitals can work, nor industrial units can work. There can be no revival, of course, of tourism. The government servants have been asked to take days off, work only 4 days a week, and use the next 2 days in the week to work on their kitchen gardens, to grow their vegetables and so on. So they are not so hard hit by inflation, which is spiraling sky high. So Sri Lanka is in deep trouble. And it is in deep trouble because I think they have tried to mollify the people, the protesters, by saying that, look, the constitutional amendments has been passed, which will curb the powers of the president. But I think nothing short of President Gotabaya going back to his home is going to satisfy the protesters. But that is also not going to solve Sri Lanka's problems, because the wealth which has been siphoned off from the national coffers to families' coffers, or has been wasted away on grandiose schemes which have not been productive, or they have ended up in a debt trap with China, cannot be remedied overnight. So the problem for India is a very acute one, because Sri Lanka is not only next door. Sri Lankans would expect India to be not only compassionate, but walk the extra mile. The Indians are more than willing to do it. The Indians realize at this moment that Indian diplomacy should be focused not only to provide relief to the Jaffna Tamils or the people of more recent Indian origin, the Tamils and Indians are focused now in reviving the Sri Lankan economy. But at the same time, one should not underestimate, while the people at large would be very understanding of the Indian aid coming, delays in the Indian aid, but ultimately the dispersal of the Indian aid would depend on how efficient the Sri Lankan government is. There are no signs that in near future the present government can get its act together and do this. At the moment, the Sri Lankan Sinhalas, the Tamils, the Christians, the Muslims are unified against this gigantic corruption, this misgovernance, this use of brute force, the dynastic rule, but it has shaken the system, but it has not brought about a revolution which has thrown the people in power totally out, discarded them, and start building from scratch. So to say that the next 2 years are going to be very hard is easy for somebody occupying the position of the Prime Minister. For the person on the road, person on the street, person in the countryside, the next 2 years is going to be a matter of survival, life and death. So there might be disease, there might be lack of medical care, there might be failure of agriculture, there might be no earnings. So you can't go back to hunting, gathering in the third decade of 21st century. So Indians have to be very careful, because some of this unrest, the tremors will be felt in neighboring states also. This is what India has to be very careful about. Another neighbor, Bangladesh, has been in focus. And this has been in focus for floods, unprecedented floods in decades, which are sweeping Assam and adjacent areas in Bangladesh. It again has underlined the issue that the politics may have divided us. There may be an international border which separates the two countries, but the ecosystem is such, the river system is such, that whether it is a cyclone, whether it is a flood, whether it is the rivers in spate, we have to be together to meet with these calamities. Tsunami had brought it in sharp focus some years back. But Bangladesh, unfortunately, has been undergoing some other problems also. Bangladesh, there was a fire in an industrial unit where hundreds of people died, and which once again focused the attention on that trying to get ahead fast in economics, to develop economically, how certain compromises are made in terms of security of the people who are working, flouting of the laws which apply to factories and so on. But there have been always silver linings in darkest clouds. So when Bangladesh inaugurated the longest bridge over River Padma, it was a matter of pride, not only for Bangladesh, it is a matter of pride and satisfaction for India also. Because this long bridge was made by Bangladesh entirely on its own resources. When the World Bank, IMF, etc. had said it was not viable, the technological know-how was provided by Bangladeshis themselves. So it is a testimony to what Bangladesh can do on its own, and where India's pride and India's satisfaction comes is that this cuts down journey time not only between Kolkata and Dhaka, it cuts out journey time between northeastern states in Bangladesh. It provides much better connectivity to landlocked countries like Bhutan and Nepal, and also it can be the harbinger of similar connectivity connecting India with Southeast Asia. So on the whole, on balance, there have been disturbing signs in Sri Lanka, reinforcement of shared concerns about climate and ecosystems in Bangladesh and India, and some satisfaction about what our neighbors can do. So we can also celebrate their achievements, let them feel good, and have a mutually beneficial relationship. This is all we have for you this time. And it's a fascinating survey. We surveyed from a totally unofficial, informal get-together of the Shangri-La Dialogues, trying to revive the interest in setting up an agenda, broad-based agenda, which others should follow by the Western countries. Then we moved over to BRICS, the BRICS Summit, where China is trying to enlarge the membership of BRICS to its own advantage. How is it going to affect India? But still, BRICS gives India a forum, which is an option to retain its autonomy in foreign policy decision-making and not be pressurized too much by the so-called Western democracies trying to impose their democratic perspective on India. Then we moved over to G7, where it is a very interesting combination, again an informal get-together of countries which are economically powerful and trying to use their economic muscle to drive a political agenda elsewhere, and also to retain their monopolistic control on the resources of other countries in the world, and the contradictions within the G7, which were brought about by keeping China out, by expelling Russia, keeping India as a special invitee temporarily. So this is what I think we should find very useful in our discussions about questions likely to come for the UPSC examinations. We also must not forget Africa, and Africa is a continent which has 54, 55 countries, depending on how you count them. And then you have problems of the African continent, which are not necessarily always similar, though all born of colonialism, all born of the spread of Islamic fundamentalism. But there are countries which are economically rich in resources, but in the throes of anarchy, others where the sovereign governments have almost abdicated their authority. And how does India pursue its interest is an interesting question. And when the Prime Minister comes and touches the UAE, he indicates that how bilateral diplomacy has to be balanced with multilateral diplomacy, or the other way around. Nor should we ever neglect our neighbors. We would like to emphasize once again, there are times when India should not play the big brother and say, look, we did this for this neighbor, we do this for that neighbor. But it is time to celebrate the achievements like the Padma Bridge of Bangladesh and say, look, we take pride in what our neighbors can do, which benefits us also. So this is all we have for you this time. Think about all these issues till we meet again next time. Thank you and goodbye.